So good morning, and good to be back for this topic. So for now, anyway, we are carrying on the series of Jewish thinkers, their lives and their times, and I really wanted to look at the early period of Ashkenazi history, in which the great Rashi looms large, and he'll be the sort of anchor around which we build everything else. But I did want to use this as a chance to look at the influences on Rashi, who were Rashi's teachers, who were the great people that preceded Rashi, and the effect of Rashi, the consequence of Rashi, and others, those who followed Rashi, who are the Baalei Tosafos. So if we look at early Ashkenazi history, much of which is shrouded in mystery, Rashi didn't emerge from a vacuum. There were great figures before him in yeshivas. Rashi himself then was this towering figure that sort of dominates that whole period of Ashkenazi history. And then Rashi triggered a revolution in the Derech Limud, which led to the era of the Baalei Tosfos. At the same time and in parallel, there was a mystical, pietic school going on, many of whom were very closely related and interacted with the halachists that we're talking about. And these are known as the Chassidei Ashkenaz, the pious ones of Ashkenaz, not to be confused with the Chassidic movement triggered by the Baal Shem Tov 500 years later, 600 years later. Here we're talking about a movement of Kabbalists and those who followed pietic practices. That means very extensive tefillah, fasting, self-flagellation, and a whole array of sort of mystical learnings and practices, and beautiful poetry that they wrote. The Shirei HaKovod that we sing to this day, the most famous of which is Anim Zemiras, comes from that school. So there's so much going on of sort of massive intellectual ferment and religious vibrancy in the era of Ashkenaz. And I really wanted to talk about all of that. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the origins of Ashkenaz leading to the great figure of Rashi. And then as a sort of separate mini-series, we'll look at Tosfos, the Baalei Tosfos, and the Chassidei Ashkenaz. So that's the structure for the next few weeks. Rashi needs no introduction. This is not an unknown figure. We've spoken about some figures in our series of great Jewish thinkers who perhaps we've barely heard of, but were very, very influential. Rashi obviously needs no introduction at all. Born in 1040, died in 1105, so lived 65 years. Died just at the start of and witnessed some of the massacres of the early Crusades, tragically. A figure that we don't know an enormous amount about his life, but we will look a little bit at what we do know of his life, and of course, who achieved just a staggering amount. It's difficult to understand how one person could do in a single lifetime, in short 65 years, what he did. But very briefly, as a young man educated in the yeshivas of Germany, moves back to his native France, I'm sorry, where he sets up yeshiva in forgive my French accent, in Troyes, if that's how it's pronounced. He's the Rosh Yeshiva there, he's the Av Beis Din, and in that time, besides his responsibilities as an Av Beis Din and as a Rosh Yeshiva, he raises a whole generation of students. Basically, everyone after Rashi are his students in the whole of the Ashkenazi world, and eventually in the whole of the world. He writes, of course, on Kol HaTorah Kula. He becomes the most important commentator on the whole of Tanakh, more or less, and the whole of Shas, more or less. So maybe the odd Masechta where we don't have his commentary or something got lost, but basically that's his achievement. In addition, he writes Piyutim. We have hundreds of Piskei Halacha from him to Shuvas. So he's also writing the whole time a responsa to questioners. I think we have about 300 of them recorded by him and by his students, and there's presumably many hundreds or thousands more. And it's just astounding the sort of halachic works. So his influence is just unprecedented, and I'm not going to belabor the point. We all know that everything basically starts and finishes with Rashi. When we're done, they talk about the two-finger model of learning, right? So when you learn Gemara, you have one finger on the page of the Gemara and the other finger on Rashi, and when you learn Nach, that's also what you do. And of course, there's others. Then everyone else then starts with that. The Tosafos argue with Rashi, the Ramban and Al Torah argues with Rashi, but everything almost starts with Rashi. So it's just astounding. I will talk more about his life and what we do know about it later, but for now I want to look on where did Rashi emerge from. So here we go back really to the dawn of Ashkenazi history. When and where did Jews arrive at Ashkenaz, and how did it become such a flourishing Torah center? So first, a comment about the word Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz was the Jewish name for Germany, but because Germany became so dominant, it became the name effectively of the Jews in Germany. When I say Germany, I mean primarily in that era, the Jews clustered around Shum. Shum stands for spires, the shin, worms, the miser, and Mainz or Magnesia. So the three communities, spires, worms, and Mentz, or the Jews called it Magnesia. These were the three communities, and around that there's 40, 50, 100 little shtetl, they didn't call it shtetl, little villages and smaller Jewish communities. They are the origins of the sort of Ashkenazi civilization, as it were, are in that region of Shum, but then it spreads into parts of northern France, and Troyes is an example of that. It's not in Germany, it's in France. The Baalei flourish in France all the way to Paris. So all of that becomes generically known as Ashkenaz sometime around the year 800, perhaps, and on. And then, of course, from the 1200s and on 1200s, Jews begin spreading eastwards to Austria, which is Österreich, is the eastern empire part of Germany, and then on to, these are misnomers, not called Austria at the time, and then to Poland, when invited by the Polish kings, and then eventually to Russia, and therefore all Jews of that whole region are known as Ashkenazim. In the era we're talking about, the dawn of Ashkenazi history, from let's say the year 300 to the year 800, we're talking just about that small region of Germany. Where does the name Ashkenaz come from? So like many of the medieval names, place names given to Jewish areas, it's a biblical name, but it's not actually what the Tanakh is referring to. So in Tanakh, the Pasuk talks about an area called Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz Gomer, if you look at the 70 descendants of Noach, and it was referenced elsewhere, and no one thinks that's really Germany. It's not the actual German community, but Jews took the name Ashkenaz and applied to the area. Why? Perhaps because of semantic similarity to one of the names that the area was referred to, but they named it Ashkenaz. Similarly, Spain, Sfarad, probably isn't the biblical Spain. There's a slight chance that it is, because Spain, of course, is in the Mediterranean basin, so it's possible it's referred to in Tanakh, but it's unlikely that. And then we have, for example, other areas. The Slavic regions are known by Jews in that area as Canaan. Why are they called Canaan? Because the Slavic regions were the source of slaves. Western Europe was invading the Slavic regions, capturing slaves and bringing them over. That's the etymological link between slave and Slavic. And therefore the Jews called it Canaan because Eved Kanani. So they took names for various regions and gave them quasi-biblical names. So Ashkenaz is not the biblical Ashkenaz, but that's what it's known as, and that's what it's called. When did Jews come to Ashkenaz? So there's a number of legends. There's a footnote on the Rashi in Shoftim, not from Rashi himself, but from a later person, who on the terrible civil war that took place in Sefer Shoftim between Shevet Binyamin and everyone else. I'm not going to go through the whole history of that, but we're talking here about pre-first Beis HaMikdash. So we're talking about the era of the Shoftim, a couple of hundred years after entering Eretz Yisrael, and there was a terrible civil war between the tribe of Binyamin and everyone else over the Plegesh Begiva, the terrible story with the concubine of Giva, and it's a horrible story, but there's a terrible civil war. And there's a footnote that says that some of the refugees from Binyamin ran all the way to Germany. Difficult to understand historically, but I mention this legend simply to say that Ashkenazi Jews felt they were very, very old. They'd been there a long time. There's a Chasam Sofer who cites a tradition that there was a Shifra Charufa buried in Germany, that there was a cave of a Shifra Harufa still to be found in the gravestone. A Shifra Harufa is a Jewish maidservant who has an interesting halachic status, again, which I'm not going to go into, but Jews didn't keep Avodim Ivriim, Jewish slaves, as far as we can tell, after the era of the Bayis Rishon. Bayis Sheni, they still had Avodim Kananim. Shifra Harufa is connected with that, the era of the Bayis Sheni. So perhaps again, an indication of some sort of ancient origin. Most likely, Jews arrived in Germany with the spread of the Roman Empire. That's the most reasonable route that they would have arrived there, yes.
This is called the DNA Ashkenazi Jews.
Yes.
Any of us from Ashkenazi background, when we do a DNA test, they can identify, in my case, 98.8%.
Yes.
Why? Because they say that there are a very limited number of, starting can't do that.
Yes.
There are only a very limited number.
So I'll get to that in a second. The Ashkenazi DNA dates to around the year 1000, and I'll come to that and that bottleneck, genetic bottleneck that you're referring to, which is entirely correct. We're still much earlier than that. We're in the realm of legends. We're not in the realm of history at all. When I reference Jews coming there in the time of the pre-first Beis Hamikdash, it's just so hard to know what to make of that. If there's any basis of history to that, there is a tradition that when Ezra, and a quick plug here for my new series on Wednesdays, which we're looking at Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, but I'm not giving away too much. I'm not giving away too much of the theme to say that Ezra, of course, is associated with the return to Eretz Israel after Galus Bavel. And by tradition, Ezra wrote to various communities trying to persuade them to come back to Eretz Israel. And there is a legend that one of the communities he wrote to was Mainz, again, this region in Germany, in which case we're looking at, so again, just to give a timeline, if Jews came there in the era of Shoftim, which I don't think anyone can say with a completely straight face, then you're looking at 3,000 years ago. If you're talking about Jews being written by Ezra to come back to Eretz Israel, you're talking about 2,500 years ago. Again, there's no way to know any proper veracity to these reports, but thus goes the legend. And apparently the response of the Jews of Magnesia is, you keep your Yerushalayim in the east, we're very happy here now, Yerushalayim in the west. So again, the point isn't whether the story is historically accurate or not. The point is simply indicating the Jews felt from very, very early on that they had a very vibrant Jewish life in Germany. That's what we can take out of the story if we're talking about pre-Bayis Sheni, so we're talking about 2,500 years ago. Okay, when certainly did a large number of Jews arrive, and what probably is the best historical guess? Probably the spread of the Roman Empire. That's how to reasonably assume they were to spread. That area is the real border territory of the Roman Empire. It's the furthest extent of the Roman Empire. If we're talking about the Roman Empire dominated already Eretz Israel some 200 years before the Churban. So in the year 100 before the Common Era, Jews are part of the Roman Empire. Once you're part of the Roman Empire, you can travel within a custom zone. And you don't have to have your passport. You can freely travel. You're somewhat protected by Roman law and by Roman authority. So Jews begin spreading everywhere because they want to make parnasa. They traders and they engage in livelihood. And therefore Jews begin spreading through the Roman Empire and probably reach, at least in small numbers, all the way to the Rhineland region, all the way to Shum. So that's probably the first time there's sort of significant Jewish presence in the region. We do have from around the year 300 some references to Jews in Christian edicts. We have some anti-Semitic decrees that are already made, Christian worries about the amount of trading that's going on between Christians and Jews. So there's some sort of early indication of Jewish presence. What else do we know about this? Well, we know that the area after the fall of the Roman Empire begins coalescing into its own state, and the state is what's called the Frankish Kingdom. Translation of the word Frankish Kingdom means it's largely France, but it stretches into that region of Germany, and the kings begin unifying that area, the Frankish Kingdom, into its own political entity. They adopt Christianity, and they begin trying to make a national identity. And around the year 539 in Orleans, there's beginning to be worry about Jews and Christians trading with Jews, and warnings against Christians being influenced by Jewish belief and so on. So there's already a small number of Jews there who are featuring in the law. I now move forward to around about the year 715 when things begin becoming much clearer. So just again, a bit of general history. The Frankish kingdom eventually evolves under what's called the Carolingian dynasty. This is Charlemagne, so it's just a little bit of history without going too far into things. Basically, the Roman Empire in the west falls. Rome falls to the barbarians. Europe begins forming little clusters of identity. In the east, Rome persists. But by the way, I don't want to go too far off topic, but Rome is, if you are living in the Eastern Roman Empire in let's say, what modern day Istanbul, what was known as Constantinople, what we call the Byzantine Empire. If you're living there in the year 1000, you're basically part of an empire that has existed for 1,500 years. When we talk about the length of the British Empire, or perhaps the length of the American reign as the most powerful country in the world, we're talking hundreds of years. Rome lasts for an awfully long time. In the West, however, Rome falls, and Europe enters into a decline in civilization and gradually begins to re-emerge. So we're now about 300 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire doesn't fall in one go, it falls in pieces. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the region of France and parts of Germany, the Frankish kingdom, has a king rises to power known as Papin the Short, who is the father of the famous Charlemagne, and he's the first of the kings who are now going to dominate Europe for hundreds of years. And he invites Jews to settle his land. That we know. Charlemagne invites Jews to settle land. He becomes the first emperor of Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire 300 years ago. Eventually, his area is known as, it becomes the Holy Roman Empire, not holy, not Roman, and not an empire, but it becomes a sort of, they claim to be successors of the Roman Empire in some shape or form. And here we're now entering the realm of history rather than legends. We know that they're Jewish, or speculation. We know that they're Jewish traders there. We know that he's keen to get them to help him economically develop the area, and Jewish life begins flourishing. Jewish trading networks get set up, and the area is actually very prosperous. I want to mention at this point that we sort of think when we look at ancient history that everyone was cut off from everyone else, and it's not true. There's constant trading going on in the world. So through the power of the Rhine, which is this river network and very, very easy to navigate, Rhineland is trading with Italy. Italy is trading with Egypt. Egypt is trading with Bovel, with Babylonia, with Iraq. They're trading with Yemen. So they are part of a sort of global village that are all interacting with each other. And we know that from archaeological finds that in digs around the Rhineland, you can find coins with Arabic on, you can find coins with Aramaic on, you can sort of, they're all trading with each other. And they're now, at that point, the heartlands of what will become the Ashkenazi world are sort of connected with the rest of the world. So this is more or less the Jewish situation from the year 700. Numbers begin building up, and eventually Ashkenazi civilization develops. Here we come to Avram's point that even in the peak of Ashkenazi prosperity at that time, around the generation of Rashi approximately, so we're now, again, just so we don't lose the timeline, we've moved from the realm of legends, possible pre-first Beis HaMikdash legends, Golos Bovel legends, pre-second Beis HaMikdash legends, speculation that in the closing days of the second Beis HaMikdash on through the post-Churban era, as Eretz Yisrael enters part of the Roman sphere, Jews are traveling all over the place. Some hints from Christian anti-Semitic legislation, anti-Jewish legislation, that there are at least some Jews floating around the area in the year 300, 600. We're now around the year 800, and we know that there's Jewish trading centers going on. We know there's a Jewish population building up. Around the year 900 to 1000, there's a proper Jewish settlement there with a very clear sense of its own identity, and as we'll see soon, flourishing Torah learning going on. At that point, Ashkenaz really becomes one of the great sort of Jewish civilizations. It becomes a great sense of Jewish life. Around that time, we begin having population figure numbers. So, and here we get to Avram's point. So till that era, we're talking about tiny numbers. We don't really know what the numbers are. Around that time, Ashkenazim, are perhaps 3% of the Jewish population. So we're talking about a very, very tiny population, maybe talking about 100,000, something like that. And that's the extent of the Ashkenazi population in the year 1000. And Ashkenazim, by the way, remain a minority all the way through till the 17th century or so. It's really only with the end of the 18th century that Ashkenazim begin dominating Jewish world. largely because of external reasons. In other words, Ashkenazim are largely living in the West, which is developing fast. There's a massive population explosion in the West because of healthcare, because of a decline in infant mortality, because of rising economic forces, and therefore the Ashkenazi population shoots up along with everyone else's. And by the year 1930, the Holocaust, Ashkenazim were about 92% of the world population. But as everyone correctly said, in the year 1000, the Ashkenazi population is very, very small, and that's why there's very, very good genetic markers for Ashkenazi descent, because we all basically have a shared bunch of genes. Anyone who's Ashkenazi has a very small shared bunch of genes. There weren't that many of us. All Ashkenazim are no more than 8th cousins of each other, 10th cousins of each other because of this population explosion. And that's why there's so many genetic diseases also, because genetic bottleneck means that there's just not enough genetic diversity, hence the genetic bottleneck and the bottleneck. It also means, by the way, that I'm no mathematician, but I'm told by mathematicians that any Ashkenazi alive today has a 90% chance of being a descendant of any single Ashkenazi alive in that 1,000 years ago. So if you go back in time, we all have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. And there comes a point where the doubling simply becomes too many and you begin getting overlap. So everyone sitting here has a 90% chance probably of being a descendant of Rashi, which is a nice thought. If you feel you have no Yeshus in your family, you all Jews have Yeshus. Yeshus is not Chas v'Shalom a divide between Ashkenazim and Sfardim, but if you're Ashkenazi, you're almost certainly a pretty good chance of being descendant of some of the Rishonim of Ashkenaz, just because of this tiny population. Yes. Sorry. So I'll come to that soon, but basically you're talking about what in an anachronism we'll call Sfardim and Middle Eastern Jews and so on. Yeah.
Perhaps to the supposed 6 or so the Jewish women, the mothers of all the Ashkenazi women.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Question of why Ashkenazi Jews, how the development of Ashkenazi Jewry's ethnic complexion resembling their environment.
Okay, so there are a number of genetic theories out there. And I am, again, no mathematician nor geneticist, but I have spoken to experts to try and understand this. My children, for my birthday a few years ago, got me one of these DNA analysis kits. It sounds like it wasn't done one if you say you're 98% Ashkenazi. In our family tradition, we, as far as we know, we're 100% Ashkenazi. I always assume that was wrong because of look how I look. I have very, very Semitic features. I'm fairly dark-skinned. I tan very easily. I may have mentioned before when I have a very Palestinian face, actually. When I was living in Israel, there was an era where terrorists were dressing up as from Jews, unfortunately, to do terror attacks. And I used to get hauled off the bus the whole time. So they would come onto a bus, they would do a quick scan, and they were trained to identify, to profile. And I kept on falling under the profile of a Palestinian face. And it's quite scary, actually, because you get hauled off the bus, and then you get asked a question like, what bracha to make on bread? Very interesting. Or finish the final paragraph of Shema. And you had to answer on the spot, because they were trained to ask certain questions which were unlikely to be in the syllabus of very, very scary. And you sort of freeze for a minute and think, do you mean Pasa Baba Kislinism? So I assumed I had some Sardi ancestry, and we don't, and this is evidently a Semitic face. So there you are. Why am I saying this? The truth is, I don't want to go again too far into genetics, other than to say, to the best of my understanding, there's a lot of it falls under the category of lies and statistics. There's a circularity around it in which basically you test populations of those who think they are 100% Ashkenazi, and then you say that those are the genes of what it means to be 100% Ashkenazi. So there's something circular around the whole project, which is why I say that labeling oneself 98% Ashkenazi or 100% Ashkenazi is somewhat of a fiction. Also, the statistics of how genes get lost, it happens very, very quickly, and then they're doing samples of genes, they're not doing the whole of genes. So to the best of my understanding as a non-expert, having spoken to people, the science isn't as developed as the sort of popularizers of it want to claim. Then there's a second genetic theory around Ashkenazim, which was promoted in the 1800s, the so-called Khazar or Khuzari descent of Ashkenazim. And to this day, you'll see it featuring online amongst Muslim conspiracy theorists, amongst anti-Zionist conspiracy theorists, and so on, in which they say Ashkenazim aren't even Jews at all. This population is of non-Jewish origin, Yiddish speaking, they're not even speaking a Semitic language. Look at Ashkenazim with their blonde hair and ginger hair and blue eyes, and they very clearly are not of Jewish descent. And where do they come from? They come from non-Jewish populations around, either the mass conversion of the Khazars, the Khuzari story, which we spoke about in this forum, or from intermarriage in the early years of Ashkenazi history and so on. So the Khazar theory has been extensively debunked. The genetic evidence doesn't indicate anything remotely like that, and the history doesn't indicate any mass conversion. As we discussed when we spoke of the Khazar conversion, it was small scale and doesn't seem to have had much mix with the rest of the Ashkenazi population. There's no evidence that they migrated northwards and ended up even mixing into East European Jews, never mind into West European Jews. The numbers and the populations were low, so that's been largely debunked. And then you get the question of, okay, what was the either intermarriage rate or conversion rate, and you have wildly differing statistics out there. Certainly from when numbers become a little more reliable, it would seem we're looking at less than 1% per century. So we're looking at relatively small numbers. And the difference in appearance is explicable through the amount of genetic diversity that you would have even in a small population, and a small amount of conversion or intermarriage taking place. We don't realize how fast, when you have genetic diversity, how fast external appearance can change. So to the best of my very, very limited understanding of a complicated science, there's nothing out there that particularly contradicts our understanding of where we come from. And at the moment now, that's about as far as we can go with it. So this is what we know of Ashkenazi population around the year 1000, a relatively small population of Jews who have somehow ended up there in that region of Germany. What about now the flourishing of Jewish life and Torah knowledge? So I'll just pause. So far I hope reasonably clear. We're talking about geographically and historically how Jews end up there. Okay. How does a flourishing Jewish Torah center emerge? How does that suddenly appear? Where does it come from? What are the origins of this? So just to put this in context, in the year 1040, you have the most outstanding commentary of the whole Torah written in Germany. Rashi doesn't emerge from anywhere. Maybe now we'll work back in time and we'll sort of trace where Rashi emerges from, and with that try and understand how Torah arrived in that region of the world. Really good question. Was there any precursors to Rashi? And the answer is yes and no, like all good Jewish answers. There are proto-commentaries that also exist that emerge from a similar region in the world. And Rashi definitely wasn't operating in a vacuum. Rashi learnt in a yeshiva, and in that yeshiva, there were Rashi is referred to by the Baalei as kuntras. Kuntras means booklet. Rashi's commentary originally featured as notebooks, and in the yeshiva were other notebooks floating around by other students and by generations before Rashi. So the concept of having notebooks where you try and make a running commentary on Shas, but not talking about Torah now, was around pre-Rashi, and Rashi probably used some of these to help him in his writings. In addition, as one who learns Shas knows, there are various mesechtas where we're not sure that Rashi wrote the Perush, and there's a Perush floating around which looks somewhat like Rashi, but isn't exactly Rashi, and these may have come from other students of Rashi in his generation, or earlier generations, who were writing similar sorts of commentaries. So Rashi wasn't operating in a vacuum. In fact, this is one of the unique features of the Ashkenazi civilization, that they're doing this. They're writing a running commentary in that way. No one else really seems to have thought of doing that. Very, very, very interesting. Okay, so what do we know about Rashi's precursors and where he comes from and how he operates and who his teachers were? So we know Rashi's immediate teachers. He had a few teachers. He references them. Again, Rashi, born in 1034. We're talking a generation back. So to the best of our understanding, we're talking about figures who were born somewhere in the late 1900s, died somewhere in the middle 1000s. That's roughly the era we're talking about. Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Yoka. Rashi references this. Quick show of hands. Anyone heard of Rabbeinu ben Yoka? Is that a familiar name at all? Not to put anyone on the spot. Quite amazing. So almost unheard of name. But Rashi references 5 times in Shas. And as far as we understand, he was Rashi's main Rebbe. Whenever Rashi talks about my teacher, that's how he's referring to Mori. Occasionally Rashi talks about Mori. He's talking about Reben Yakar. Then there's another teacher of Rashi who certainly no one has heard of, called Rabbi Yitzchaki ben Eliezer Halevi. Again, Rashi references him a few times, and various other teachers. Rashi speaks about a teacher of his called Rameshulam Gaon, he calls him. We're going to come back to that title shortly. Gaon is the name normally we associate with Bovel, as the Rosh Hashivas of Bovel, but Rashi calls his teacher Rameshulam Gaon. And he had an uncle, Reb Shimon HaGadol, not the more famous Reb Shimon HaGadol, Reb Shimon the Great, who was probably not an uncle of his, probably a great uncle or something like that, who was an influence on him. So there's a cadre of scholars who influence him. Where do these scholars come from? So they come from someone who all of us have heard of, Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom ben Yehuda, Rabbeinu Gershom Ur HaGola. So Rabbeinu Gershom is, so again, just one generation back from Rashi. We're talking about Reben Yakar, born 990, dying 1050 something, 1060. Rashi's other Rebbe, again, born somewhere like that, so generation before Rashi. We now go to Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom is the teacher of Rashi's teachers. And Rabbeinu Gershom is a staggering figure. He's a towering figure. The title he's given is Rabbeinu Gershom Ma'or HaGola, the light of the exile. And he quite simply lights up Germany. That's when Germany becomes alive. So if you want to know when do the lights go on in Jewish Germany, the answer is certainly before Rabbeinu Gershom, but the first time we see the lights coming on, and suddenly we're getting outstanding Torah and illuminating authority, as if from nowhere emerges this figure, Rabbeinu Gershom Ba'or HaGola, who has a status like no other. And his influence spreads certainly across the whole Ashkenazi world, which is very small, but even beyond that. 400 years later, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher, says for us, Ashkenazim, everything Rabbeinu Gershom Ur HaGola writes is like Ki'ilun Nitno B'Sinai. It's as if it was given on Sinai. It's just absolutely authoritative. He is the Rebbe of the whole of the Ashkenazi world. Rashi, who's a student of his, says everyone, the whole of the Ashkenazi world, we're all Talmidim of his. And we are to this day. So anyone sitting here is a Talmid of his. He is a Rosh Yeshiva in Magnesia, Mainz. And remember that place because we're going to come back to it. There is a flourishing yeshiva in Mainz. We don't know the names of most of the scholars. They're referred to as Chachmei Magnesia, and they appear in halachic literature every so often. Chachmei Magnesia. And it was already a vibrant culture. There was something Ashkenazi about it already then. When you think about sort of Yiddish jokes from the 1800s and the whole sort of Ashkenazi wit and humor and sharpness and its ability just to argue, imagine a shtiebel where everyone's arguing back and forth, that you get that vibrancy of Chachmei Magnesia. It comes through the textual work. One of the most famous disputes in Chachmei Magnesia is a Baalei who makes a mistake on Rosh Hashanah in his blowing of the shofar, and the whole yeshiva begins tummeling. They're all arguing about how to deal with this situation. And there's records of the debate of different views about does he have to go back or doesn't he have to go back, and how to deal with it. And then the stuff gets after Rosh Hashanah gets written up, and letters are going backwards and forwards. So it's this very vibrant culture, and the Colossus astride this whole vibrant Chachmei Magnesia is the amazing Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom, born again in the mid-900s in Metz. He calls I don't know what to call it, a conference of sorts, in which he says, we've got this Ashkenazi culture now booming, Baruch Hashem, amazing, and we have to begin sorting things out. We have to adapt to our new place of location. Don't forget, probably most of the people he's dealing with are first, second, third, fourth generation immigrants, because that's how long the Ashkenazi world is. And that's how long it's existed. And he says we're living in Christian Europe. We've never really had a massive population living in North Europe before. And, well, we know what's Rabbeinu Gershom famous for. He's famous for Charomim, a series of decrees. He's not Chazal. He doesn't have the ability to make a new Takana Rabbanon, but he wants to do the same thing. So what device do you use? You make a Cherem, which is binding on all Ashkenazim for all future time, maybe 1,000 years, maybe forever. And what are the Charomim that he makes? Only a single wife, Cherem number 1. Sorry? Opening post. Okay. Any other Charomim that we're aware of? Divorce. You can't divorce a woman against her free will, etc. There's actually many more that he does. So let's just unpick them one by one and understand why he creates them. Jews only having one wife. He's living in Europe where polygamy is frowned on. It's seen as immoral, adulterous, and it's not good for Jews to be seen as less moral as their Christian neighbors. And there's maybe other reasons, internal reasons, financial reasons. So he bans polygamy, marrying multiple wives. With that also goes not being able to force a wife to accept a get to Baal Kacha, not being able to force a divorce. Opening mail, very, very important. He forbids one Jew to open the mail of another. Jews are traders, they're writing backwards and forwards. If trade secrets can't be trusted, if you can never know who's going to open the mail, then the whole Jewish economy is going to fall apart. He makes Charomim about apostasy, about mumma, in some ways tightening the regulations, but in other ways also allowing more space for someone to be choser b'tshuva, and he creates like a ritual for someone who has converted to Christianity to come back. So you get a sort of idea of his influence and his power, and he is the Rebbe of everyone. He is this tyrant colossus. On the side of many Masechtas and Shas is written, and this comes back, Simon, now to your question again, not with Nach, but with Shas, is written a commentary known as Perish, sometimes it says Ragma, which stands for Rabbeinu Gershom Or HaGola. On the side of the Shas, you see a commentary, a very, very small commentary. So it's not a big commentary like Rashi, it's printed in a very, very small font on the side of the Gemara. This is known as the Perish of Rabbeinu Gershom Or HaGola. And again, it's a type of proto-Rashi in a sense. It's a limited version of a running commentary on Shas in which Pshat is trying to be explained. Probably not written by Rabbeinu Gershom Or HaGola himself, probably written by some anonymous students in the yeshiva of Chachmei Mainz. So basically, 2 generations before Rashi, you have a flourishing yeshiva in Mainz with high level Gemara learning going on, important halachas, and enormous self-confidence. Rabbeinu Gershom is confident to make takonos for the whole of his region. So he's a strong, confident leader who's able to make decrees. And out of his yeshiva, and his predecessors' yeshivas are emerging proto-Rashi commentaries, these booklets, of which one we have printed on some Masechtas inside the Gemara, known as the commentary of Rabbeinu Gershom Or HaGola, but probably just from the yeshiva of Or HaGola. Okay, where does that come from? So going back another generation. So current academic thinking is that there are 2 main influxes into the Ashkenazi world. So here I just want to, or three main influxes, and here I just want to distinguish between the 3 of them. Influx number 1 are human beings, masses of humans who, as far as we can tell, are probably economic migrants invited by the developing Frankish Empire, Pep in the Short and onwards, to begin trading. And Jews move to the Ashkenazi geography in large numbers from the year 650, 700, 800. So by the time you get to, as I said, to the year 900, and Rabbeinu Gershom flourishing, there's a significant population, not very small by modern standards, maybe 100,000, but still a significant population with a very vibrant culture. That's the sort of biological influence. Where do these Jews come from biologically? Who knows? All over the place. But they coalesce into a small genetic bottleneck, which becomes Ashkenazi Jewry. Second school of influence is something which triggers a massive surge in Jewish scholarship and halacha. And we're going to call this influence X for a few moments. We're not going to label this influence. And the third halachic influence is stream number 1 that I mentioned is biological. It's just people, migration. The next 2 streams are intellectual or cultural. Cultural influence number 1 we're going to call X, somehow transporting high-level Talmudic scholarship to the area. Cultural influence number 2 is language, piyut, Kabbalah, machshava, culture, and that comes from Italy into Germany. So just to summarize, there are three things that form Ashkenazi Jew. There's raw human material, forgive me for speaking that way, there's people who migrate for economic reasons from all over the Roman Empire, we don't know exactly from where, probably from South France and up, probably making their way along the trade routes and so on. Then you have intellectual influence number one, which is halachic and Talmudic, and is fiercely loyal to Talmud Bavli. And then you have intellectual influence number two, which is Italian and Kabbalistic, poetical, and the like. And I just want to unpick these last two schools of influence. There was a lot of confusion about this for really hundreds of years, but what I'm telling you is how consensus has sort of coalesced and emerged. What we now know and we have recorded, and this was known all along, we didn't understand it properly, is that there was a wave of immigration from Italy into Germany, possibly not large numbers, but certainly influential. Who were these immigrants, the influential ones? They came from the famous Kalonymos family. So Kalonymos is a Greek Latin name, which Jews took on as a Jewish name, became Kalman. I think I mentioned this recently when I spoke perhaps in the setting, I can't remember why it came up. And a family of poets, paitanim, and scholars moved to Germany and become one strand of religious leadership in Germany. And they are the authors of many of the Piyutim that we have, and are very influential on Ashkenazi culture. It's possible also that they are influenced in their minhagim by Talmud Yerushalmi and by Eretz Yisrael practice. How would that happen? Because, well, Italy is on the Mediterranean basin, not that far from Eretz Yisrael, and some of the halachas that they bring in their piyutim and some of the minhagim that Ashkenazi Jews have seem to be influenced by Yerushalmi, what we call Talmud Yerushalmi, which means Eretz Yisrael minhag. These are not the people who bring the primary halachic influence over to Germany, because the people that bring the primary halachic influence over Germany are only interested in Talmud Bavli, and they bring Babylonian halacha over. And for those who are interested in this is the source of one of the areas where you get a clash between minhag and halacha, because minhagim are influenced in early Ashkenaz quite significantly by Italian Jews, who are coming from the very old Italian community, which of course predates the Ashkenazi world, because that's where Jews went to Rome and so on. And they are perhaps in close contact the whole time with Eretz Yisrael. And Germany is very influenced halachically by Talmud Bavli. That's our Talmud. That's what we follow. That's how we live our lives. From a political point of view, Eretz Yisrael is part of the Roman Empire. Rome is fiercely at war with the empire further to the east, which is roughly the Babylonian empires. And therefore, there's not much communication between Roman Jewry and Bovel. The communication is somewhat limited at later times in history. And therefore, Italian minhagim veer a little bit off Babylonian minhagim. And there's an influence of that on the Ashkenazi world. There's a remarkable sefer called the Rokeach. The Rokeach is written by Rabbi Loza of Worms. He belongs to the Chassidei Ashkenaz, who we're going to talk about later. Chassidei Ashkenaz are the Kabbalistic and Pietic school within Germany, who are very influenced by the Kalonymos family. They are descendants of the Kalonymos family. Rabbi Loza of Worms, so we're talking about the Rokeach, talking about 150 years after Rashi, 1176 or so. That's the family that Rabbi Yehuda Chassid comes from, Rabbi Loza Chassid comes from. The Rokeach means the Rokeach is a pharmacy. The perfumer actually means in that day. He wrote a Kabbalistic work, the Rokeach, and there he brings his family traditions generation after generation back to the Kalonymos family who came over from Italy, and there's no reason to doubt that family tradition. He says, I am Elazar, the Baalei Rokeach. I'm the son of Rabbi Yehuda, who's the son of Rabbi Kalonymos, who's the son of Moshe, who's the son of Rabbi Yehuda, who's the son of another Rabbi Kalonymos, who's the son of another Moshe, who's the son of another Rabbi Kalonymos, who's the son of Yehuda. And I've got a Masorah that goes back to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, to Rabbi Shmuel HaChassid, to Rabbi Loza of Spires that we already mentioned. And he's got a family tree which is reliable, no reason to doubt in any way. And we know many of these figures from other records. And therefore, basically, we can trace back the Kalonymos family, the Chassidei Ashkenaz, the authors of Piyutim, the source of many German minhagim, back to Italian Jewry. So that's one stream of influence. However, this is not the stream of influence on the halachic learning that's going on in Germany. And this the flourishing of the yeshiva in Magnesia and the emergence of a figure like Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, who in turn developed such a large body of students that out of that could emerge a Rashi. I want to explain that a genius can't emerge from nowhere. Even a Rashi has to come. You have to have a critical mass, or statistically, of enough Talmidim till one is a Rashi. And even a Rashi can't invent the wheel completely. He has to come from a base medrash where learning is going on. So that the possibility of such vibrancy emerging from the Ashkenazi world is down to Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah and the yeshiva of Chachmei Magnesia. And that comes from somewhere else. What is that somewhere else from which it comes? We're going to label it X, and that's basically what I have to say on it. What do I mean by that? We don't know. It's a mystery. You have this massive Talmudic academy, this massive yeshiva with vibrant Torah scholarship going on, with a colossus of a Talmudic scholar, Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, and we don't really know what the influence of it was. We don't really know where it came from. I will tell you the best we know in a minute. I'm not just going to stop by saying X, but it's very, very limited. Okay, so I just want to contextualize ourselves so we don't lose way in all of this discussion. The first part, we spoke about the migration of human beings. We spoke about economic migration, legends about the origins, but somewhere around the year 700, population begins building up. And by the year 1000, they're a reasonably substantial population with a flourishing Jewish economy and flourishing Torah learning. Where does the flourishing Torah learning come from? One branch of it, Minhagim, Piyutim, Kabbalah certainly, pietic practices, comes from the amazing Kalonymos family. And of course, they're also Torah scholars. They also teach Torah, Talmud, they also teach halacha, but they're not, as far as we can tell, anywhere close to being vibrant enough to have brought this massive learning culture. They weren't Rosh yeshivas, they were Piyutim, a different sort of mindset. Secondly, as far as we can tell, their way of halachic thinking was different to the yeshiva of Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, and there's even some indications of tensions between the two sorts of leadership classes. So there's another leadership class which is enormously high-level, vibrant yeshivish culture, learning Gemara and halacha, and we don't really know where it came from. What can we say about it? So first, I just want to emphasize the degree of mystery around this problem. And this I think I've said before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But basically, if you go back to the year 900, the state of the Jewish world is that if you want to psak halacha on a high level, if you want to know anything beyond a really basic thing, you write a letter to the Gaonim in Bavel, and you get your letter back 6 months later. So you're living in a backwater of Jewish life. That's really what the Rhineland is. It's a complete backwater of Jewish life. There's the odd scholar mentioned, but there's nothing creative particularly that we're aware of happening there. There's nothing exciting going on. It's a real backwater of Jewish life. And by the way, so is Spain. So in many ways is even Italy. So is North Africa. None of them have anything particularly vibrant going on. What do Jews in North Africa, Spain, Italy, Germany do if they have a shaila? They post it to the Gaonim in Bavel, in Iraq, at the centers of the great Babylonian yeshivas, and they get a reply back 6 months later. How does it get there? I already mentioned there's trading links from Germany, you send it on to Italy, from Italy it goes to Egypt, from Egypt it makes its way to Iraq. It's only 4 or 5 stopping stations. People are anyway communicating like that because they're trading the whole time. So there's networks of postal services and the like, and Jews use that to find out halacha. Fast forward to the year 950, 1000, you have flourishing Torah centers in Ashkenaz that we've been speaking about, but also in North Africa, where you have the Rimagash, which leads to the Rif, also in Spain, and Spain and North Africa are sort of one community at the time, they were all under Muslim rule, in Italy, etc. How did that massive change happen? Not just you have these flourishing Torah centers, but Bavel has gone into sharp decline. Bavel is no longer the center of the Jewish world. So to summarize, year 850, 900, one Torah center in the Jewish world, Bavel, with not even in Eretz Israel is there much of a Torah center at all. I think we may have discussed Eretz Israel. If not, we should do that era of history of Eretz Israel. But really one Torah center in the world. 100 years later, 5 or 6 really dominant Torah centers. Bavel's still an important Torah center, but not central anymore. No one's writing letters backwards and forwards. But you've got North Africa, you've got Italy, you've got Spain, you've got Provence, you've got Germany. Massive change in between the two, and we know a lot about this from the Cairo Geniza. We always knew about this because there were always some teshuvas going floating around, but we know much more about this since the discovery of the Cairo Geniza. How did that change happen? We don't really know. X. That's the mystery. We don't really know how that change happened. The best analogy I can give, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself here, is equivalent to if a historian knew the state of Torah scholarship in the year 1930 and the state of Torah scholarship in 2030, and they didn't know what happened in between. So imagine you're a historian in the year 3000, sitting here talking about history, and you say, in the year 1930, where's the main Torah center in the world? East Europe, pretty much. Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, a little bit in North Africa, a little bit in the Middle East, but much smaller. But those are the main Torah centers. Fast forward 100 years, where are the main Torah centers? Not much Torah in anymore, sadly, in North Africa, not much anywhere in the Middle East besides one country we'll come to. Not much going on in East Europe at all. Where are the main Torah centers? Eretz Yisrael in America. So you have this massive shift. How did it happen? Imagine we didn't know the answer to that question. So something massive has to happen to make such a shift, and we don't really know what caused that shift.
There are the influence of the spread of the written version of the Gemara.
Okay, so we don't think anything massive happened like the equivalent of the Holocaust. We think, I mean, it's impossible to think that because we've run. So the analogy, I'm only using the model from 1930 to 2030 to say the enormity of the shift. But what led to the shift is not entirely clear. Probably things like the spread of the written word of the Gemara, probably things like economic influence changing, economies rising and economies falling. We know that, for example, the economy of the Rhineland goes through a boom at the time. We know that the Babylonian economy goes down, and you can only have Torah scholarship when you've got a reasonable economy to fund it. It could be the rise of one led to the decline of the other, because Jews were sending money to the Goyim to thank them for they were sort of outsourcing their Torah learning and funding yeshivas. As they got their own yeshivas, they stopped sending money to Bovel. So there's a series of probably lots and lots of little things that somehow reach a tipping point. All I'm saying is that somehow from the year 850, 900 to the year 1000, a massive tipping point occurs in Jewish history, and we don't really know how to explain all the bits and pieces that add up. No one thinks that any of these explanations are enough to explain it completely, but it remains a bit of a mystery. Yeah, sorry.
In the learning issue, what do they have today? Is there an account of, let's say, Russian that they learned, but just hasn't come into our Gemara? They have the equivalent of a Rashi there.
No. So this is a really good question. What do the Goyim write, and what do we have of them? I'm going to put that question on hold because it deserves talking about properly. But I just want to continue our chain, and then we'll get back to that. So the era of Goyim come to an end. This is what signals the end of the era of the Goyim, really, and the beginning of the era of the Rishonim. Goyim, more or less centralized body of yeshivas in Bovel. Rishonim, geographically diverse leaders in Germany, Spain, Italy, Provence, etc. That's the shift. The other thing that happens because of this divide is that you begin developing geographical minhagim. So when everyone is under the influence of the Goyim, to the degree that Babylonian halacha dominates, you have everyone writing the letters to the Goyim, and everyone has a sort of unified Goyimic halacha. Once they split into different areas, you now get Ashkenazi Jews developing, Sephardi Jews developing. Why? Because Ashkenazim turn to their local posek, they turn to Rashi or Rabbeinu Gershom, or later the Rosh, and Sephardim turn to their poskim, the Rambam or the Rashba or the Ritva, and therefore different regions develop slightly different halachic traditions because all the leaders, generation after generation of students of the earlier generation, and all the shilas are being asked of geographically close rabbis. So in the Gaonic era, you're asking your shilas of a centralized body to some degree. In the era of the Rishonim, things are becoming geographically diverse. So just to summarize, there is a massive shift in Torah that takes place in a very, very short amount of time, and we don't know exactly what triggered and how it worked. There is been a very, very influential essay written by Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who we had the honor of hosting, I think, about 10 years ago here and 9 years ago here and there. And I think Michael Pollock has spoken about this also. He writes this essay called The Third Yeshiva of Bovel. And I just want to summarize a moderated version of what he says. He takes this very far, and I'm dust under his feet, so I don't want to argue with him. But I don't think anyone is convinced about his theory as far as he takes it. So I'm going to say a modified, moderated version of what he says. But kind of the headlines of what he says is that it's helpful to think of the yeshiva of Magnesia as a third yeshiva of Bovel. And that brings out the enormity of what Chachmei Magnesia is. There's yeshivas in Bovel, Surah, Pompadisa, famous names, and suddenly, in the backwaters of nowhere, you have another yeshiva which is behaving as if it's a Babylonian yeshiva. It has a Rosh Yeshiva Rabbeinu Gershom Or HaGola, who's absolutely self-confident, happy to create decrees. Everyone is this Talmud. The Torah he teaches as if it's given from Sinai, and he's a colossus on the Torah stage, and he's got this vibrant yeshiva with learning going on and amazing Talmudim coming out, and they're producing remarkable works that no one else has done since the era of Gemara, and it's behaving as if it's another yeshiva of Bovel. More than that, we have some hints that they call their Rosh Yeshivas Gaonim. As I mentioned, Rashi refers to his Rebbe as Rishonim Gon. So they're even adopting a Babylonian title for a couple of generations before the era of Rishonim properly kicks in. So that brings out again the how did this happen? How did a Babylonian yeshiva arrive on the shores of the Rhine? Like how does that work? It's 9:57. I start my next show at 10 o'clock, so we're going to stop at that crunch point, and we'll start next week about the Gaonim, what the Gaonim produced, what the literary works were, what was unique about Ashkenazi culture, because it's only Ashkenazi culture that has the Yeshivas Chachamim Menvencia, the equivalent of that, and what we do know, or what we can guess about how a Babylonian yeshiva ends up on the Rhinelands in a moderated version of Professor Soloveitchik's theory. Okay.